Yes, another pod. 2 straight days. Recruiting talk. Is everything okay for Nebraska? With a special guest next.
You are Locked On Nebraska, your daily Nebraska Cornhuskers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Good morning, and thanks for making Locked On Nebraska your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins.
All right, welcome in. It is a Tuesday episode here of the Locked On Nebraska podcast. Connor Hepper, Mitch Sherman with you, and we are joined today, as you may be able to see if you're watching along with us on YouTube, by Mike Schaefer of Husker247. I think the first, or maybe, is this the third time you've now been on the show, or just the second?
I think it's the second, and I want to say that my claim to fame is that I was the first guest that you had on the Locked On podcast.
Yes, I think that's right. I think you're one of like 4 tops. So,
awesome. Nice.
Yeah, definitely like the first two-time guy. And as we mentioned on yesterday's show, Mitch and I haven't necessarily been fully tapped into what's going on. Mitch has been on a boat out of the country, and I've been really just been more lazy than anything. So this is where we lean on Schaefer, talking about the big recruiting event from over the weekend, and really more what's going on with Nebraska recruiting. So Schaefer, thanks for doing this. Thanks for stopping by. I guess the Boneyard event has now been the talk of. I mean, there was multiple national recruiting reporters in town from over the weekend. Seemed like a pretty unique deal. Like, what's been the initial sort of takeaway that you've gotten from people who were at it, and most importantly, the recruits who were at it over the weekend?
Yeah, I think the sort of big takeaway is that Nebraska had this as an event to kind of showcase itself, the program, the coaches, the facilities, and they face the challenge every single recruiting cycle of how do you change the perception of what people think Nebraska is as a state, as a place, as a program. And there's no shortage of examples of recruits the Huskers would never get until they actually got them on campus to see what it was like. And usually it takes multiple visits to get guys to commit to your program. So to get an early visit for a 27 recruit or a 28 recruit, or there was even players that just finished their 8th grade seasons that already have a Nebraska offer that were there on Friday night. So we're talking 2029. We're getting dangerously close to 2030, which feels scary to me as someone whose first class he covered was 2012. So, you know, we're getting up there quite a bit. So,
2012, you say, huh? As I remember, Amon Green from the class of 1995.
No, I never covered recruiting daily until 2011. But it's not that I didn't follow it during what for me was the heyday of the whole Bill Callahan experience, was
right.
All of the different people that were coming into town for all of that. But yeah, I mean, this is sort of that same idea. Like, get a lot of talent, get them in to see Lincoln, show them what you're trying to build, showcase your 2027 quarterback commit by all accounts, Trae Taylor, while maybe not being the MVP of the weekend, could have a really strong case for it. One, with his performance as a quarterback for this Miami Raw 7-on-7 team that he joined up with, but also just because he has become the ambassador for the state in a weird way. He's spent more time in Lincoln than either of you guys have in the month of June this year. He quite frankly had spent more time on campus than I might have spent on campus in all of 2025 so far in the 8 days that he's been around Nebraska football this month. So this is a guy that has just been really, really involved. And so you have all of this going on, and it's just set against the backdrop of a Matt Rhule program that kind of needs a boost on the field, but also wants to make sure that if they do start winning, they're in position to get some high level recruits on the back end of that. And so you gotta put in the work early, and hope it all comes together. That was a very scrambled, long-winded answer. I apologize.
I want to ask you, that's okay. That's why you're here. I want to ask you this about Trae Taylor. And I this just came into my head when you talked about him being the ambassador and in Lincoln for the entire month of June so far. How do you think, because he's a 27 guy and the Ryolas are both older than him, how do you think that this meshes with the entire Ryola family takeover of Nebraska football, for lack of a better way to describe it? You have Dylan, who has presumably 2 years left in the program, and Dayton, who still has to play his senior year and is one season older than Trae Taylor, because Dayton's been around too, and he's also someone with the kind of personality, in my opinion, having talked to him and spent time around him, who will be a good peer recruiter.
Yeah, it's like a fascinating dynamic, because what Trae Taylor is doing is what Nebraska fans would have hoped from Dylan Raiola had he committed in, say, March of 2023, instead of flipping at the end of the cycle in December of 2023. And so I don't know how the dynamic necessarily meshes up, but this is exactly what you would want if you are able to land a top of the line quarterback, because you want them visible, you want them, extolling the virtues of your program and talking about the culture and all of these sorts of things. And then he proved it on the field with his play with the 7-on-7. So I think there's all of that points in the direction of what people would have hoped that Dylan Raiola would be. And then Dylan Raiola gets here in that December, and he's able to connect with an Isaiah Nair in the transfer portal, and he's making the phone calls, and he's doing that kind of work. But it does come off a little bit different when it's a 2027 talking with other 27s and 28s and 29s. Because at this point, Dylan Raiola's goal, he's kind of weirdly in the halfway point of his Nebraska career, even though he's only just going into his second season. I don't anticipate there's a fourth season. There's a world in which there's not a third season. I don't want to just put that out in the ether, but I think we have to at least acknowledge if Nebraska doesn't play well, there's a chance he's just not coming back for a third year. His goal is to win a championship. If he doesn't feel like he can do that in his time at Nebraska, we'll worry about that in December. But so I don't know that the Nebraska coaches could particularly sit around and care how the Ryola family feels about Trae Taylor and sort of his marketability. And I know that wasn't your question, but I do think that there's a feeling, at least from maybe inside and definitely outside, that this thing is sort of run by the Ryolas. So Trae Taylor is a bit of a counter to that. And he is as aggressive as a social media content maker that we've seen in this NIL era. I think he's very smart to the idea that if he comes to a place like Nebraska and he gets an opportunity to play early, there's a lot of extra benefits that come along with that and expectations. And he seems to be welcoming of all of those things.
The more alphas, the better.
Unique to see it. Yeah, I think Nebraska needs that. I think they kind of need a bunch of guys who are going to push each other in different ways, and it's not always going to be kumbaya and everything like that too. Now, should this all go how Nebraska wants, there's never any crossover with Dylan and with Trae. And maybe that gets a very motivated Dayton Raiola to show up and just start his career on fire. The problem he faces as a peer recruiter is, unlike his brother, he didn't really go on the camp circuit. He hasn't really been on the 7-on-7. He hasn't pursued the idea of being a national level recruit. I don't think he's pursued another program besides Nebraska football since he was like 7th or 8th grade. I mean, Dayton has always loved Nebraska, and I think he's always wanted to go to Nebraska. They have a different personality, Dylan and Dayton do.
Right.
And so, how Dayton has helped in this 2026 class is sort of an open-ended question, because we don't hear his name a lot. You don't hear other recruits sort of mention him. And I wonder, a handful of guys, I wonder if they have a group chat where you have him and CJ, who's got one foot out the door anyways, Devin Bonwell-Witt, who may be a commitment, may not be, with a different wide receiver coach and coming off of a knee injury. And then Jace Reynolds, who's a nice linebacker recruit in Nebraska that the majority of national recruits would never have heard of. Like it is a wild class as we sit here on, what is it, June 9th or, June 10th. I don't know what day it is ever, but to only have 4 commits, one of which you're not even sure if you're going to keep, one of which you're not even sure if he's going to keep you, a quarterback that's been pretty quiet on the national scene, and an in-state commitment. Like the peer recruiting isn't necessarily happening in the 2026 cycle right now.
Yeah, Schaefer, I want to talk about that and more on the 26 class. But that's a good place to take our first break here. So we'll come back and then we'll talk more about the big picture as far as Nebraska's recruiting is concerned. All coming up on the Locked On Nebraska podcast. But first, a word from our friends at the FanDuel Sportsbook, where the NBA playoffs are beginning to wind down at this point. We are coming up on game 3 of the NBA playoffs, or the NBA finals rather, between the Pacers and the Thunder. And now is a great time for you to get involved on the action. Hit that first $5 bet and you're going to get $200 in bonus bets. And there's a lot of ways that you can use that first $5 bet. Why not a same game parlay to start things off in the NBA finals? Player props. We're talking about all the regular stuff as well. Over-unders, spreads, and everything in between. The FanDuel Sportsbook is your place to be and keeps you in on the action all the time. Live betting and plenty more. Once again, place that first $5 bet at FanDuel.com, and if it wins, you're going to get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
All right, welcome back. This Tuesday episode of the Locked On Nebraska podcast. Mitch Sherman of The Athletic, Connor Happer, 1620 The Zone, joined by Mike Schaefer of Husker 247. Mike, we began at the end of that that last part of the conversation to talk about Nebraska's 2026 recruiting class. And Connor, you, I think, have a question for Mike or a topic as it relates to that.
Well, I think a lot's been made, and we talk about the recruiting calendar like all the time on this show, Schaefer, and everything is just kind of sped up now, and it feels like a lot of guys are making decisions, and the summer is always a really important time because a lot of the guys want to have their minds made up before they go into their senior football seasons, and that's right around the corner. It's coming up. Nebraska, like where do they stand right now? How far behind? Is it fair to categorize them as being behind on the 26th at this moment? And are they sort of pouring all their chips into this season, to try and capitalize on what they could do on the field, even for 26?
Yeah, 26 is sort of fascinating because Matt Rhule had stood up in front of us in media appearances and kind of pointed that it was going to go in this direction by saying he didn't want to have to double back on things that he told recruits. And so where you have places like Miami that is just openly going to pay Jackson Cantwell $2 million of their pie, and whether or not we believe that they're only going to spend whatever the settlement and everything's going to go through the clearinghouse and et cetera, is to be determined later on. But Nebraska, I don't think has ever wanted to be that aggressive. I think they wanted to see how everything was going to kind of come together. They knew that they were going to have a smaller class, so I don't think they felt compelled to make promises on the front end, nor do they want to pay players who that much money when they haven't been in the program. I mean, Matt Rhule's been pretty honest about it, that it would have to be a massive difference maker. Even Dylan Raiola was expected to start as a freshman, so it wasn't like you were giving. Yeah, and Jackson Cantwell, if he doesn't start as a freshman, it's a lot of money on your bench. And so I think they just wanted to be in a wait-and-see approach. And so because of that, they've kind of been a little bit behind here in 2026. But they also don't have to go as far to catch up. It's not going to be a 25-person class. If it's a 12 to 15-person class, they're a third of the way there if they're going to 12 right now. So I think they've had a pretty good visit weekend here coming off the last couple of days. I think they're in position to land several players from it. And so those numbers are going to go up. I think the difference for me is I'm not looking for a big star in this class necessarily. Like even looking at the names that they're recruiting, they'd have to pull a Brian Bonner. They'd have to get a Jordan Campbell to flip off of Miami later in the year if they're doing well in their season, and maybe Miami isn't playing as well. I just don't know that they're going to have like a Dawson Merritt or Cortez Mills like talent in their class. But if you think about it, they didn't have those guys until late November and December last year. And so it could very well be put your best foot forward. If people don't come in for official visit to June, that's fine. Bring them out for the Michigan game, or bring them out for what do they get? Somebody in October. I mean, when USC comes to town or something like that. So they still are going to have opportunities, but it just doesn't feel like there was the urgency to make this 2026 class a big statement. Whereas what we've seen is they put a lot of chips in 27 and 28 already. They have a bunch of offers out. They've had a bunch of these guys come in for visits. They had, obviously this event that took place. You have players that have met with Trae Taylor or talked with Trae Taylor, and you have your quarterback in place. And so if they were to have a big season in 2025, it certainly leaves them in a good spot to add for the 26 class, while also building the framework for what could be one of their best recruiting classes in a long time. But it's contingent on the idea that they are in an actual national conversation, not that they back into going 8-4 and don't really have any notable wins. And, Dana Holgerson's offense is just so, and Dylan Raiola doesn't take the next step. They have to be like a nationally conversed about team, I think, for them to get the full effect of the groundwork that they've laid so far.
That's a lot of eggs in that basket of winning games.
It's a gamble. Yeah. It's a big gamble. But in the transfer portal era, you could also argue that if they only take 12, and it's not the greatest class ever, they could still throw a lot of money and assemble people through the portal and find players. And they have a young team. And it feels weird because it feels like we've said they've had a young team for a while, even though they had a bunch of old pieces last year, guys that have stuck around for extra eligibility. But they have a lot of players. They have to figure out who they are, like what they have in their defensive backfield and what they have at wide receiver beyond some of the, a Dane Key or something like that. And then it can kind of set a pathway of what do we actually need to get as a program, because they've done a nice job in some ways. I mean, quarterback recruiting under this staff versus Mario Verduzco, just talk yourself through some of the names that Nebraska ended up with, or even who they were chasing and the careers that never happened with some of those players. And here you have Dylan Raiola, TJ Lateef, Dayton Raiola, and Trae Taylor. Those are their first 4 quarterbacks that they've added or gotten verbal commitments from. So that's pretty remarkable. So I think in some ways you see where this could go, but it's very contingent on the idea at some point Nebraska has to win a bunch of football games and not just sort of back into or meander into a season that is okay but uninspiring.
Speaking of quarterbacks, there have been a few from the state. Nebraska, of course, also signed Danny Kalen a year ago, and then there's one in the state this year, Jet Tamala, who is committed to Iowa State, Millard South, class of 2026 quarterback, has an offer on the table from Alabama, which is fairly notable. I go back and forth on this, Mike, and I want to get your thought about what people should think. How would you guide people to view what's happening within the state in recruiting right now for Nebraska? And I asked this on the day, Monday, we're taping this, that Millard South tight end Isaac Jensen committed to Missouri.
Yep.
So this is a player that Nebraska wanted, which you can frame a bit differently than the Tamala situation, because, of course, as we've mentioned on the show, Nebraska already has Dayton Raiola as its quarterback in the 2026 class. So Jensen seemingly has been on the outside for Nebraska for a while. What's the feeling that you have here about, in particular, about recruiting inside the state borders?
It feels like there was a pretty seismic shift once Nebraska was no longer going to carry 140 players on their roster. I mean, they didn't have a walk-on class this past year. They only have offers out to 3 players currently in the 2026 class. Jace Reynolds, who committed, Isaac Jensen, who just committed to Missouri, And then Darian Jones, he's taking an official visit this upcoming weekend. But if you talk to people, it sounds like Iowa might actually be the favorite there. I mean, I think he's going to have a tough time turning down the idea of playing with his brother Donovan. They're pretty close. So we'll see how that all plays out. But that's only 3 offers in a state where Illinois has come in and gotten a commitment or gotten one commitment, and they've gone to work on like a Nelson Wheeler who's popped up, Millard South's latest contribution from the high school transfer portal window that never has closed, I guess. You got Iowa State, who has 5 guys from the state, six from the state of Nebraska. So there's a lot of Power 5 or Power 4 talent that is leaving to go elsewhere. But you have to sort of assume Nebraska, now having been here for several years, has looked at these guys either on film or in camp, have made the determination that while good, they're just not in a position where they need to take them. Their numbers are already ballooned up against whatever the 105 or whatever it's going to be before they get to the 105. They don't have the ability to put guys on what they would have called Husker scholarships in the past, where players were conceivably scholarship players, but were actually being paid for by NIL and not necessarily on true scholarship. And it allowed you to take some chances with some conceivable low-end flyers on guys that, maybe it works out in terms of development. And the other thing, and I know this doesn't sound great, but they haven't gotten any real return on investment of the in-state players they have recruited. Some of that's their own fault. They knew what they were getting with a few players that they added in the 2024 class, and they still wanted to do it because the optics were going to look good, and you took a chance. And if it didn't go great, kid goes on his way, and you go from there. So I do wonder if there's a little bit of a, hey, we've shopped in Nebraska before and it hasn't gone great. We don't have to put a lot of eggs in that basket, but we're also really interested in these 2027s over here, and Torrey Pittman, Kylan Haney, and some of those talented individuals. And so I just think there's a lot at play with it, and the change in the roster structure and how NIL is going to work, I think really sort of changed how they were going to approach the state of Nebraska. Because otherwise, I think that they would have some of these guys that are committed to Iowa State or committed to Illinois, because I think they would have done the same thing that they did with some other people, which is just put them on an NIL scholarship, because they, now they can go up to 105, but I don't know that they feel the need to necessarily do this in the same way, or that they have the same spots to play with.
Yeah. Speaking of that and how the roster is going to work, let's take another break, and we'll talk about that as we wrap up with Mike Schaefer of Husker247 coming up next. All right, welcome back. Connor Happer, Mitch Sherman, Mike Schaefer with us, talking some recruiting. And now, as we kind of move into all the other stuff, the sort of big picture and how Nebraska's roster works a little bit. Obviously, the rules, or at least the guidelines, kind of become official, or they've known about what they're going to do as far as the roster is concerned for a little while now. But you were just talking about it a little bit there, the types of guys that Nebraska has gone out after in the past to fill their roster. Maybe that's not so much an option anymore. How do you expect that sort of works now that they have the ability to have a little bit more flexibility as far as their roster is concerned with the grandfathering rule? Like, how do you sort of expect all that to work this upcoming summer and into the fall?
I don't think it's going to lead to them necessarily taking more in the 2026 class. I think a lot of it is they're in kind of wait and see mode where certain players on the roster are. And I ran through some of them earlier, but I'm thinking about somebody like a Jordan Ochoa. Like, is Jordan Ochoa, this is a big opportunity for him this sort of year. Can he make it onto the 2 deep? And then is that a guy that's able to stick around for you? Or did you, a couple years ago, see someone you were really interested in, brought him in for a few years, wanted to see where he's at, and maybe he's just not ready to play on this level? And so then you're going to see that kind of movement as well. I wonder if it leads to them wanting to be a little bit judicious in who they take in the high school level, because they want to leave a few spots open every year for FCS players that are looking to move up, or group of 5 guys, or maybe there was someone that went to a Georgia that just got slammed down by the amount of talent in front of them, but Nebraska is still interested and they want to see, what that is. So I think even though they went from an 85 scholarship to theoretically 105 scholarships, some of it is they want to keep spots open in case there's an opportunity out there that just seems like it's too good to be true. So if the next time a Sierra Wright's available and you really need a cornerback, you want to make sure that you have the flexibility with that roster. And so I think the interesting thing to me is going to be how Matt Rhule chooses to divvy up what this looks like in terms of player procurement. Is he going to take 40% high school guys and 60% portal? Is that going to be reverse? Is it going to be 80% high school guys and 20% portal? Is it going to be a year-to-year thing? When they think that they're at the higher end of their cycle, which is sort of what I think is going to be the new fascinating thing with college football. If you're a coach and you think that your team is ready to be very competitive, do you pool and try to pile a lot of your resources for 1 year guys to try to make a run to maximize that 1 year? Or if you think that you don't have the right pieces, do you try to sort of go for more high school players at that point because you want to have more time to try to build it up? So there's just a lot of different strategy that goes into it. It's why a guy like Pat Stewart was sort of hired to help you try to manage your roster the most effective way that you can.
Yeah, I don't imagine that Pat Stewart, and I've heard him speak in a press conference setting once, so it's not like I've got the keys to unlocking the inside of all of his thoughts about football, but he doesn't impress me as the kind of guy who's going to have sentimental feelings because someone is from Omaha Central, say, or
No.
Omaha West Side.
No.
I'm curious, going back to the 105, we talked about this on the show Monday, and the date is now out there after the House settlement was approved last Friday. July 6th, Nebraska and every other school must designate players who will count above the 105. These are players that Nebraska's saying it would have cut if it had been a hard 105.
So like a Hayes Miller who just rejoined the team after being in the
He's certainly going to be on that
portal
list.
Yeah.
He's certainly going to be a designated player on July 6th or before, but the deadline is July 6th. How many do you think they're going to put on that list?
Wouldn't surprise me if they get all the way up to 120. Probably 115, like 10.
So 10 to 15
names
players.
is sort of where I'm at with it.
Okay, pretty much where I was thinking. That's a big reduction from where Nebraska was at with its roster in the first 2 years under Matt Rhule, and for
20 to 25 players, right?
Yeah. So there has been a transformation. And I think that's a great point you bring up about the transformation of just the philosophy that Nebraska has undergone, the transformation that it's undergone with its philosophy toward roster construction. And in spite of the fact that you don't have to cut players now because the judge in this case was against it, it's still going to look a lot different in 2025 and moving forward than anything that we've gotten used to in Nebraska football.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder if a guy like Alex Bullock would have stuck around knowing that something like this would happen, and I tend to think more this other way, if he was just going to have a better opportunity with Dan Jackson at South Dakota State to get on the field, to play more, and so that's what these guys have to weigh. If you're a Hayes Miller, is it better for you to be a walk-on at Nebraska, or is there going to be more opportunity if you end up at a Nebraska Kearney or wherever it is that you could end up being? Some people are very content to be a part of the program in that they know they're not going to be playing on Saturday. They know that they're not going to have their name called out by fans or appear in the media or, come up with a game-saving interception, but they want to be there to help make the program better on the back end. And you're still going to get some of those guys that really believe in Nebraska and that sort of ethos that helped sustain that walk-on program and made it as special as it was. And so I think Nebraska, more than other programs, are likely to carry more of those guys because there's a lot of value to them. I mean, we've heard Matt Rhule choke up on the idea of having to tell someone that their career, even though that they weren't going to play, that they can't do this anymore. And so I think he's probably very in favor of the fact that they have these extra people, because he didn't want to have those conversations. He didn't want to lose some of those guys, because for every, handful that don't really contribute, they've already shown an ability to find someone, pluck them from relative obscurity, and turn them into their best linebacker all of last year in John Bullock. I mean, John Bullock, what he was at Nebraska prior to Matt Rhule showing up, is someone that likely wouldn't have been, would have been designated in this spot under a different coaching staff. I don't recall him being used a lot in 2022. And by the end of 2024, and certainly during that Colorado game when he played about as well as anybody else on the field that night, I mean, those are the kind of losses that a place like Nebraska is going to have. You think about a Jacob Bowers who sort of emerged this spring. They're going to make sure he's on the 105, but they're not going to have that opportunity going forward. So they have to be even better in terms of evaluation, and they can't waste spots because they don't have the sort of fail safe that they used to. It fascinates me because of how many careers of just people who didn't necessarily go on to be stars or anything, but they helped Nebraska. I mean, think of all the different times that you've seen someone who's walked on, like Lance Terrell against Kirk Cousins, Justin Blatchford returning a block punt for a touchdown, like guys whose careers, didn't necessarily have to exist, but were able to maximize that. And it helped fill in spots where Nebraska had some misfires in recruiting. So they're going to have to be better even in this era, even with the extra scholarships.
Schaefer, I wonder, we'll let you go on this, but I wonder how many guys who are in that same realm right there that we're talking about, whether they're, hey, do I stay here and I probably not going to play that much, or maybe have a very limited role, or do I end up at South Dakota State? I wonder how many of those guys like that they can keep, simply because of, and this goes back to the recruiting thing, how well, and you touched on it a little bit, how well they're treated here, what the facilities are like, and the meals and all the stuff like that. I would imagine that's a really significant factor for a college athlete who's trying to weigh all that stuff out.
Yeah, and there's just an element of pride. And I don't know if Mitch is around it a little bit more than you, Connor. I don't know if he's gotten this sense too. But when you talk with some of those guys over there, a lot of them, and especially a lot of those outgoing seniors, they wanted to be part of what turned this program forward. And so you don't want to be the guy who sells your Apple share right before it blows up in the 1980s.
Yeah.
You don't want to be the guy who leaves Nebraska right before they are about to go off, if you think that's what's going to happen. And I think there's some real confidence that they have something here, at least internally. And so I think there's always an element of that too. But at the end of the day, at some point, they're going to be at that 105, and they won't always sort of have that fail-safe. And I'm fascinated how they're going to get there and what that looks like. And a lot of it's contingent on how 2025 goes, because if they don't have a good season, some of why you're not necessarily loading up on high school players, if you don't have a good enough 2025, you can bet your bottom dollar they're going hard into the portal for every 1 year fix that they can get, because then they have to save their job. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I think that's while it has been difficult, some of the moves that they've made, knowing that the 105 was coming and thinking that it was going to be a hard cap for a good chunk of this offseason. I think that will serve the program better in the end. If Nebraska had gone into this in December, knowing that they could grandfather in as many players, would-be cut players, as they wanted, and they just decided to keep the roster at, say, 140 or 150 for the next year or two, and then bring it down. The fact of the matter is, at some point, Nebraska is going to have to play by the same rules as everyone else. And it's going to be 105, whether it's 2027, 2028, whatever, it's going to be 105 for everyone. And that Matt Rhule went into the offseason clear-eyed and said, we're going to have a top 57, we're going to have a next 38, and then we're going to have these 10 players at the bottom who are our culture players. That he had that kind of a formula as far back and talked about it publicly as far back as December is something that will serve the program best in the end. Now, if you're going to add 10 to 15 more players to those culture, that culture portion of the roster, great. But at least it's not 50 that you've got to cut down the road when all of your competition has already done it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that they will do they will be better served in that regard. I think they're better served just in recruiting, not having the fail safe of you could take whatever you wanted the last couple of years in terms of numbers and then just massage it later on the back end. Because I do think there comes a point where you have to decide whether this guy is going to help your program or if you're just doing it because it looks good on the front end of it and no one will feel as bad as if he leaves. I mean, I just think there's too many takes in recent years where I don't think there was a real belief that this was someone that was going to be a 4 or 5 year player or even a couple year contributor. So the less of that you have, the less filler you have on your roster. And it just seems like that's going to be better for you and your culture overall.
Mike Schaefer of Husker247. Schaefer is everywhere. You can check out the website, Nebraska Husker247, and there's podcasts, and he's on the radio every second of every day. So you could find him basically anywhere, right?
I just try to be the most oversaturated Husker media member in the most oversaturated college football market. It's a dream of mine, and I feel like I'm achieving it.
You're living it out, man. You're living it out. You earned some sort of a medal for being the 2-time guest here on the Locked On Nebraska podcast. So they send us
we have
stress
a hat
balls.
for you.
Yeah, or hats every once in a while.
I would love it. I love wearing random hats. That's my
daughter
thing.
loves a stress ball. Maybe we'll send you one of those in the mail. Schaefer, thanks for joining, and we'll do it again soon.
Okay, sounds great, guys.
Mike Schaefer, Husker247, and that is it for us today. Appreciate you making Locked On Nebraska your first listen. For your second listen, you can check out The Portal Show with Brian Smith. Find The Portal on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.